Welcome everyone to IWSA's Listening to the Wind interview series. And I'm delighted to be welcoming Patrick Englebert, CEO of Propelwind. Hello, Patrick.
Hey, Gavin. How are you today?
Very, very well. Looking forward to this presentation very much. I'm going to do a little introduction for you to just set the scene. So Patrick, he has 11 years of experience in power plant projects and waste recycling. 15 years on offshore oil and gas projects, and 15 years on maritime new building and innovation, including LNG as a fuel. So very experienced. He's now fully focused on SDGs, including wind for main propulsion as flagship projects. I believe Propelwind was launched back in 2008.
Yep. The ID started, I will say it in the presentation, but indeed the ID started in 2008 and formalized in 2011. And we met in 2012, Gavin.
That's correct. And Patrick is one of the founding members of the International Windship Association and was on the executive committee in those early years. So I should say thank you for that, Patrick. And things have developed and grown quite a bit since those early days.
Absolutely, Gavin, and thank you again to IWSA to allow me to introduce Propelwind and discuss important aspects of it.
Absolutely. So I'm going to hand over to you for your presentation.
Okay.
So
fasten seat belts for the share screen. So here is Propelwind, and as we highlight its main propulsion. Yeah, next slide. Okay, Gavin. So we started with Propelwind with ID in 2008. At that time, it was still an ID and a lot of dream work, like you see, with a catamaran with 6 wings in 6 soft sails in a row. The initial investigation confirmed that it was feasible to use wind for large vessels. So then we started the company in 2011, and based and using the capital from risk capitals and risk capital raisers and from subsidies from South Brittany, we did a lot of R&D performance studies until 2012. End of 2012, I met Gavin and Siegfried in Berlin, actually, at the seminar, and we started the IWSA. And from 2012 till on, with the low price of fuels, we had to put the company a little bit on the back burners and keep on communicating about the concept. In 2020, 2021, I did a lot of investigation for ship owners on wind for assistance to ship propulsion. But nowadays, the focus is definitely on main propulsion. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, so our main principle for wind propulsion, very important, is to make sure that you have enough speed, and a condition for that is that you should concentrate on low density cargo. And it means not crude oil, not iron ore, but for instance, passenger cars, light containers. The second principle is that we aim at using the rigid articulated wing sail because it's the most efficient wind engine you can imagine. And then the next principle, we have to prioritize wind efficiency compared to wind cargo volume and weight, because the tendency on normal ships is to take a hull and put as much as possible cargo on it and have a little bit forepeak, a little bit aftpeak, and as small as possible engine room. But if you do that on a wind-propelled vessel, you will not have enough speed and enough efficiency. The next principle is to limit the initial size, because wind is a low density medium, so you cannot propel a 300,000 deadweight vessel with wind. That will never be possible. So, and you have to start small also to limit the exposure if the the concept doesn't work correctly. So we would start with a handy-sized 3,000 deadweight hopefully in 2025, and with niche markets. But starting from that initial size, we should think about scale up in both directions. Vertical, meaning the size of the vessel, aiming at 20,000 ton deadweight in 2040. And by then, in 2040, we should be able to tackle mainstream market segments. But we should also scale up horizontally, meaning other type of cargoes than the original one, because that's a condition to make this concept suitable for large series fabrication. And these series are essential to reduce the capex. We'll talk about the capex a little bit later. Yes, next one. Now, talking about capex, yeah, everybody's saying, yeah, wind-propelled vessel will cost a lot of money. Yeah, okay, but then let's look at the wind turbine industry and compare the cost of a 9 megawatt genset to a 9 megawatt wind turbines. And all we can see is that when you take a wind turbine onshore, the price, the investment in the wind turbine is 2 to 2.5 times the one for the genset. If you now go offshore, which is everybody is going offshore now, for obvious reason of wind power, the factor is 5, and if you go offshore floating, it's factor 7, and still this factor 7 does not prevent this industry from booming nowadays. And actually, the payback period I calculated recently on the short term, when the carbon pricing will be above $200 per ton CO2, you can have a short back period less than 5 to 6 years. And on the midterm, when green fuel will be the standard, hopefully in 2030, then the payback period will be even shorter. Yeah, next. And looking at expensive stuff, let's compare from the car industry, the Toyota Prius and the Tesla Model 3. The Toyota Prius is hybrid, Tesla is full electric, a little bit the same difference as between wind for assistance and wind for main propulsion. And when we look at those figures, you can see that even if it's much more expensive, the Model 3 is much more expensive than the Toyota Prius, eventually in 2020, they've sold 5 times more Model 3 than Toyota Prius, and the capitalization of Tesla compared to Toyota is also factor 5. So it is not a stupid idea to put a lot of money in something that is extremely disruptive, let's say, on one side, but corresponding to a need today of decarbonization, of efficient and quick decarbonization. Yeah, next. So, and we use base or design a lot on the offshore or the sail racing technology. It is a real technology, and it's no more a bricolage like it was 50 years ago. It has evolved constantly since the 60s. And nowadays, you see the reference speed used to be 10 knots in the 60s, and now with the last design of foiler-based trimaran, the aim at 50 knots, 50. Of course, we are not pretending that tomorrow we will have cargo flying at 50 knots, but let's say if people are able to master the technology and sail at 50 knots, it means they must be able to produce the correct design for cargo vessels with sufficient speed. Yes. Next. Okay. What is our proposal today? For today's needs, we aim at a monohull, and this is just a kind of outline data, main particulars of a monohull with 3,000 ton deadweight corresponding to 222 heavy TEU at 14 tons, but still a very large cargo hold. So you could install 420 TEU, meaning 24,000 cubic meter, or use that space for cars or for light light bulk like grain and pellets. So this again is an important factor when you see the TEU, the TEUs for a container ship. They say 24,000, 25,000, but it's not all heavy. It's not very clear whether it is heavy TEU or light TEU. And that's what we clarify here. So the clean fuel for assistance, initially we would take LPG. Why LPG? Because LPG is a closest fuel to liquid ammonia. So if you install an LPG mechanical propulsion with tanks and engines burning LPG today as kind of intermediate or transition fuel, you will be very well prepared to later on to put green ammonia, which use exactly the same tanks, exactly the same fuel system, etc. So what is very important as well, and that's why we announce a fast monohull. Our target is to have an average speed with true wind speed of 50 knots of at least 50 knots, which means that 50 knots will be the average between the wind at 45 degrees, 90 degrees, 135 degrees, meaning that when the wind is at 90 degrees, you will have, of course, much more than 50 knots. Why not? And when you are with the wind at 45 degrees, then it will be at 10, 12 knots. But it's very important to have enough speed. Then this monohull will be specifically designed for high harbor compatibility on both levels, maneuverability on one side with azipod at the stern and pump jet in the bow, and also specially designed self-loading, unloading, so you don't need any harbor infrastructure. Yeah, next. But our future-proof solution is for us the trimaran. The trimaran cargo, you don't have any more stability concerns thanks to the outer hulls. You don't need ballast water, which today it's still an issue in shipping. You can store the clean fuel safely in the outer rigs. You have higher speed with wind. It's very seaworthy as compared to the catamaran. We have already in mind an innovative cargo handling, and it's really straight and DNA from ocean racing technology. The only problem is that today they don't like it in harbor, and this is the reason why we shifted recently, actually in October last year, the priority from trimaran to monohull. I could keep on speaking during half an hour, 3 hours, 6 hours, as you like, but I give it the word back to Gavin for further discussion. But this was kind of our introduction to Propelwind. Gavin, to you.
Oh, no, thank you very much, Patrick. Fascinating. I'm going to do the stop share now, so we come back on that.
Yeah.
No, thank you very much for sharing all of that, and really practical application of existing technologies being brought together in a really innovative and what I really like, the innovative design, but also those operational considerations are obviously folding into the approaches that you're doing. So the port infrastructure existing needs to be obviously adapted to, but then having that additional step forward where actually port infrastructure may be able to be innovated onto to take in vessels in the future. I was just going to ask you, you mentioned about, and if we could just touch on this a little bit, you mentioned about the timeline around 2025 for the monohull at a handyman size, yeah?
Yes, for the initial one, we start small because it will be easier to risk money on a small vessel than a large one. And one thing I learned from 50 years with the shipping, you have to be modest against Neptunus because he's very strong, and you should gradually increase the size and start with something that he can accept easily.
No, absolutely. No, it makes complete sense. And the routes that you are looking at for this to be operational on, if you were to select, say, a primary route or a type of operational profile cargoes, what do you think that would likely be?
The highways for wind are North Atlantic, westbound, North America, Europe, or Asia, North America. These are what I call the highways for wind propulsion. But in fact, you can go everywhere except, and it's very easy to identify the except, it's West Africa. I will never have a wind ship propelled from South Africa to Nigeria back and forth. West Africa, you have to forget. And the important trade route from Asia back to Europe, with a large part in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. There is not enough wind, but everywhere else you have enough wind, and that's how the planet was globalized 100 years ago, because this ship slowly but surely could get everywhere. And today the situation is much better than 100 years ago, because assistance to propulsion, routing, you have a lot of tools to make sure that wherever you could go 100 years ago, you can go today, and even better.
Right. And actually, on that point, on the routing, you mentioned about, obviously areas of the doldrums or areas of low wind facility. Have you looked at the production of fuel on board the vessel as well? No. So using that excess wind when it is blowing too much to generate fuel on board or energy on board?
No, I think generate energy, yes, because when you have excess wind, you would load batteries. But I don't want to make life on board too complicated and producing hydrogen like the Energy Observer is doing on the laboratory condition. But loading batteries, yes. And anyhow, having on board enough fuel for mechanical propulsion, for harbor operations, for safety, and for crossing areas like you mentioned, the doldrums.
Sure.
And at a limited speed, 10 knots and 10 knots and anyhow calm condition, and 4 to 10 days, depending on the areas. But for me, it's essential to have mechanical propulsion on board. Nowadays, by the way, it is mandatory for the wind rules from Lloyd's, DNV, etc. But it's also, let's say, to make sure that you can get to move in any situation. But I hope I will be able to match what Grain de Sail is doing with their ship, because Grain de Sail is this French company, for a round trip, Europe, America, South America, and back to Europe. They use just a very little number of liters of gas oil, only to go in and out of the harbor. That is for me the kind of ideal conditions, but whether it will be possible with a large ship remains to be proven. But that's
sure. That scaling is it's well. I thought actually it's very pertinent, the graphic that you had there on, I think, the second slide with the EWEA graphic of the size of wind turbines and the development of those. And I thought that the comparison of the Prius and the Tesla as well is, the scale of or the scaling up of the systems. At the moment we're seeing generally smaller systems being applied, but that optimization and that growth in scale of wind is a critical one. And we're in a learning process as well of what is working, what is going to be delivering on the potential at every stage of that development. So really exciting times.
I think it's essential to build in the scaling path from day one. And I've already prepared for every 5 years what would be the size of the vessel, following the same curve as the wind turbines. And that is why I can say no. So we start with 220 TU. In 5 years from now, we would go to 500, 400, 500 TU. And then you can start addressing wider segments, because talking about container vessels, today there are only about 200 container vessels, less than 500 TU. So you cannot focus on that. You have to keep growing, to expand also the application of the design. And actually, you need to do that also eventually to have an impact on the CO2 emission from shipping. You cannot do that with a lot of small vessels. You have to grow in size of the vessel and the number of vessels where it is applied.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's scaling. I think there's going to be niche activities going on in all different segments, but yeah, I mean, the scale up to the very large vessels indeed. And that brings me to one of the questions that I've got for you. You know, we've got a lot of deliberations at IMO at the moment, also in the EU, around the whole fabric of decarbonisation and the driving aspects. For example, you know, the EDI, EXI, CII process, but also we've got discussions around market-based measures, carbon levies, etc.
Yep.
How do you see the inclusion of those and the development of those affecting wind propulsion in general?
Yeah, I think EXI, EDI, the same family of concept. It has to be revised and updated and corrected. And there is people, because if you just, for instance, look at this formula, you show that to the CFO, he will collapse, because it's impossible to understand to the decision makers. It looks like tools from the engineers to keep them busy. So EXI, EDI has to be improved. CII in turn, I think, is a much better tool, because it's closer to reality and it's dynamic, because the requirement will grow will stricter in the time. And that is an excellent opportunity to wind for assistance to ship propulsion retrofits. Because what you do today, you can also do better tomorrow, because going from 1 rotor to 4 rotors, it's let's say motivated by CII. And market-based measure, definitely yes. When I was very happy to see Trafigura proposing $250 to $300 per ton CO2, because that makes wind propulsion, even main propulsion, absolutely economic viable. I mean, with a payback period less than 5 years, which is kind of a threshold for us. And so EXI, EDI, hopefully to be corrected. CII, yes, excellent. And MBM, provided it's above 200, let's say, like I mentioned on the presentation. And anything below that is, let's say, not sufficient.
Right. So I can imagine it will probably be incremental. You know, as you say, the Trafigura proposal is a very large carbon levy to be brought in one bite. But as you say, you know, as a driver for wind as a primary propulsion device, it would certainly do that. Absolutely. We were talking about your long time in the energy markets and substantial time around wind propulsion, and of course we met in 2012. So we were better and younger versions of ourselves at that time.
Still young.
Absolutely. What changes have you seen in the industry, you know, around wind propulsion and if you like, the perception of wind propulsion in the industry over those years?
That is a very good question, because I remember at the GST Green Ship Technology Conference 2013, I was asking, let's say, your colleague Craig Eason, what is your opinion? What is your opinion about what the ship owners think about wind technology? And he said, for dreamers. And that was 2013. It was very straightforward, and you could see that he was not convinced, but that was what he was hearing from ship owners. And I would say recently I've been working with ship owners for wind for assistance, and still wind is perceived by, let's say, 70 to 80% of the people as something for driven. But happily enough, 20% is quite enthusiastic. But that is growing also thanks to the IWSA and the new own efforts. And that is item one, what has changed. What has changed also, and more recently, is the fact that cargo owners are getting involved because they get impatient about this, the slow development from IMO and from owners, charter, of the traditional stakeholders, and they bang on the table and they say, we want by 2040 to use only zero emission vessels. And by the way, we must see the first vessel hitting the water in 2030. And that is fantastic. Everybody was enthusiastic about that. And indeed, that is an excellent move to give a kick in the ass on the decarbonization. And then what is also quite important, item number 3, and IWSA is well exposed, taking benefit of that, is that big companies starting get involved. It's not mainstream, but you have a few big examples recently, Michelin with their Wissamo, Yara Marine and Bar Technology, and more recently, Alfa Laval with Wallenius. So, and that is a very good sign that people take wind seriously.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you, and in a sense, you know, you mentioned about the 20% of ship owners, maybe those first movers and the early adopters, are quite convinced that this is a credible pathway, and I think we see that with pretty much all technologies follow the same pathway. Those later adopters want to see, you know, multiple reference points in the industry, costs coming down, obviously, to make it a credible kind of a technology segment for that second wave of adopters to come in. But we're not quite there yet. No, we're getting there, but we're not quite there.
But a lot of things are changing nowadays. When you see that a company like UPS, the first picture about their sustainability is a bicycle of UPS bringing cargoes to destination in the city. 5 years ago, it would have looked like a joke, but now it's a reality. And I'm convinced that half of the pizzas delivered in London are with a bicycle. And that move is now going on, and that will help wind to get some broader acceptance.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that, you know, again, it's always about a transition, and perception is one of those things. You can hit tipping points with a change in perception, as we did with, say, wind turbines. You know, there was a big change in the perception. It's not a windmill anymore; it's an electricity wind turbine, and we saw that perception changing quite dramatically. You touched on the markets for wind propulsion, and of course you're focusing on, you know, Handymax, say at 3,000 deadweight tons, but moving up to a medium-sized vessel in the future. Which of the segments do you see will probably grow the quickest? And I'm going to break that into Europe and international. So, do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't have a crystal ball, and things are changing so much these days. But I would say, again, COSEF should, let's say, accelerate the development of small container vessel for dedicated cargo owners. I think the cargo owners, they are very impatient about what they see with the chaos in the supply chain. And you see that some, I will not name them, but they're already chartering their own vessel, which are smaller, of course, and that is what will change already this year and next year. On the larger scale, unfortunately, probably one of the growing trade is coal because of electrification. I'm not talking about in 10 years from now, with the next 2-3 years. Unfortunately, coal consumption will increase to level for developed economies to support the electric vehicles where the sales are going up. And very important as well, these data servers. Today, these big servers from Amazon, from Google, etc., are consuming as much as the aviation. Can you imagine? And that will grow. That cannot. So unfortunately, coal will grow. But on the other hand, coal is a very good opportunity for wind for assistance to ship propulsion. And that is already going on because the vessels are large, a lot of deck space, and slow. And so that is so
that bulk, dry bulk segment is both the vessels are good, but also maybe the economics are good around that during this energy transition.
Yes. And in the same stream, you have oil tankers, and you see that the projects are not too. We are not yet at the top of the crude oil production. On the contrary, it's still growing, and same as for bulk carriers. That's also a good market for wind for assistance. And for wind for main propulsion, as I said, looking at the developing countries now, and everybody is let's say, upset because India said we don't want to slow down or to, let's say, phase out coal because they still need it to fight poverty. In India, you still have a lot of people who don't have electricity. So that is another reason why coal will not slow down and is a good market for wind for assistance to ship propulsion.
Yeah, no, and I think we're seeing that in at least in the retrofit wind market, certainly bulk. There's a lot of interest from the bulker sector and the tanker sector as well. So, yeah, no, I get that completely, and I think isolating shipping outside of a total energy transition is a mistake. We look at propulsion, but we also need to look at those energy markets and what they're doing. Okay, I'm going to ask you one last question on the discussion because we're already moving forward a lot with the time. Are there any significant sort of safety or technical barriers around wind propulsion technologies now?
For safety, the obvious challenge, it's not a barrier, but it's a challenge. It's stability. You probably know that going back 100 years ago, they started producing 5 masters because they say the only way to fight against steam is to increase the size. And recently, there has been a very interesting article in one of my favorite magazines, Voile et Voilier in France, about these 5 masters. Can you imagine that out of the 7 which have been produced and which are high-tech, etc., 2 of them disappeared? Nobody knows how, nobody knows where, but they disappeared completely because you can imagine that thousands of square meters of sail, and they didn't have weather routing or whatever. So if you apply the criteria of today's wind propelled vessels, I mean 100 knots gust, I'm sure that no one of these vessels was able to take that. But so stability today is the main concern from a technical point of view. Other than that, it's the compatibility later on with green fuels, which will be dangerous on their way. Ammonia, extremely toxic, and hydrogen ignitions risk. And that is something that has to be already considered in the new design to do it safely, because you will need this green ammonia, green hydrogen to really get to zero emission, knowing that you need some mechanical propulsion on board for safety reasons.
Indeed.
Other than that, everything is solved, everything is fine, everything is there. But that is, I would say, the main concern for wind propulsion, stability and for high winds.
Yeah, and I think solutions are there. Your ballast design, for example, your trimaran system for a substantial primary wind vessel. Certainly tackles those issues, and also the ability to furl, retract systems as well are being looked at in various different ways as well. Okay, so You know me, Patrick, and I know you, and we could probably have this discussion for another couple of hours.
Definitely, definitely. You're welcome anytime, Gavin.
And I'm sure we will revisit many of these issues. And I think what is interesting is the period of time that we're in. I think is it's that early sort of launch pad period where we've got some reference ships, we've got the technologies coming through, the pipeline is very strong, and I'm just excited to see your designs on the water, hopefully before 2025. But there we go.
You will be invited in the owner's cabin for the initial vessel sea trial. I hope you are not seasick, Gavin.
Well, I'll make sure I'm not. But now I'm going to ask you we've got about 5 minutes, very quick sort of Q&A, quick fire questions. So if you can limit yourself to just a short phrase or a single sentence, that'd be great. Good. So if you had to pick the most significant remaining barrier to wind propulsion, what would that be and why?
The main barrier is convince people to put money on it. Yeah.
And why? Why is that the main barrier still?
Because it's a lot of money, and people are not ready to do that if they don't have a proof of performance. And the problem of performance, if your CFO is asking how much will I save, the engineer has to answer it depends. And CFO, like bankers, they hate when it depends. They want certainty.
Fair enough. And on a personal note, 2008, you set up Propelwind. How did that come about?
It's a long story. It started when I started sailing dinghies initially, and then the sport catamaran. And then I went up to a more elaborated sport catamaran. And I was really surprised by the power you have from wind, even on a small one. And then looking also on ocean racing and seeing that the speed was growing. And also with monohull, you don't have the heel and the stability issues. That's why I started 2008, not what I call the project or a concept. I called it a question. Is it possible? And when the answer to the question was yes, 3 years later, then I started Propelwind.
Then the engineer in you starts coming up with, okay, I'm going to make this happen.
Yes, exactly.
Great. Now, I think timing is always a challenge in business, and I think your timing when you set up in 2008 looked very, very promising timing in the world economy just before the financial collapse. When IWSA was set up, it was pretty much launched in middle 2014. After we'd done all the background work, just before the fuel price dropped dramatically. So if you could meet maybe yourself or somebody else setting up a wind propulsion company today, what advice would you give them?
Patience. Be patient, because again, you need time to convince people to use it. And that is, you have a lot of waiting time, and then people don't respond. And so you have to be really patient on one side, but also to be very honest. Don't promise things you cannot keep. This is why I also said, to the rest of the industry, I will not promote the idea that you can propel a 24,000 TEU container vessel with wind, or let's say a heavy cargo vessel. I'm realistic and limit to low density cargos, start small and grow and scale fast, but again, limited to mid-size. It means that we have to coexist with large vessels as long as they exist, using something else. But it's part of the energy mix, like wind turbines and solar will never, ever supply 100% of the world energy, at least in the next 30 years, as long as storage is not solved. And wind propulsion should be likewise a part of an energy mix. for
Absolutely.
excluding
Absolutely.
routes and the right size and the right density of cargo.
Yeah.
So we have to be honest with that.
And I think those, very much were the founding principles of IWSA, of being open, transparent, don't overpromise, but potentially overdeliver. But I think also, maybe patience wasn't one of the guiding principles, but certainly long-termism, as opposed to very short-term objectives. I think that's really important. So that's great.
And patience is difficult because you have to use that to compensate passion, because you are passionate. And so being patient is the most difficult part of it very often.
Right. Okay, great. Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to ask you a couple of very quick ones. What's the most common misconception about wind propulsion in general that you come across?
That people expect exactly the same performance as mechanical propulsion. And that is typically from renewable. You have to integrate the uncertainty and the lack of regularity in the supply chain. And today's with the when we see the delays in the supply chain, and it does not create an economic collapse. So you have to demystify the just on time, let's say, requirement. So that is, I think, the biggest misconception is to expect exactly the same while it is different.
And you dispel that through emphasizing like integration. It's an integrated approach. Yeah. Absolutely.
You have, of course, to use routing, and then it gives you a realistic ETA using wind or using WASP to the maximum extent, and you integrate that in the supply chain management, and it's a fact of life, and it can be integrated today. Yeah.
Okay, great. Just very quickly, have you done a sort of life cycle analysis, the carbon footprint of your system or your design?
Not yet. It's not yet a priority, but as soon as we will start with the real project, it's of course part of the engineering. Just as a comparison, you have seen that in wind turbine industry, they just started now producing recyclable wind turbine blades with Siemens Gamesa, and everybody will follow suit. So I'm not ashamed not to have started yet, but I promise you that it will be part of engineering.
And it will be a question that every customer is going to be asking. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the final question, just as the next one, are you currently recruiting, or do you have plans for recruiting your team in the near future?
Today, Propelwind is 5 persons, where I'm the most, let's say, involved of all the 5 compared to the 4 other ones. We just come in from time to time, but I'm preparing already job descriptions and a list of people required and cash flow forecast, because that will be part. We hope to after 2-3 years to have a team of 10 to 15 people, all based in South Brittany. Not because I love South Brittany, but it has proven in 13 years that is the most efficient part of the world to develop wind propulsion, because you have all the stakeholders that you need from technology point of view within not biking distance, but at least reasonable car distance, 150 kilometers, based in Lorient. So it's in the tube to prepare it, but I will only commit people when I can be sure that I can pay them during 2 years. Sure. Rock solid investment. That
makes complete sense, and good regional advert there. I'll just add the food is great as well. So
yeah, I'm not allowed to say that as a priority.
Absolutely. Well, look, Patrick, it's been absolutely fascinating, and as I said, we could discuss these issues and pick your brains all day long. But what I am going to do now is just give you an opportunity, just a 1 to 2 minute sort of summary or takeaway for the audience that's watching this. So I'll hand that over to you straight away.
It will be less than 1 minute. I just I could sing it. It's all we are saying, let's give wind a chance. because that's all what is needed to be to give it to become really reality. It's at least listen to the wind, in other words, which is not happening so much today, because people are focusing on expensive and long delivery fuel that will take trillions of US dollar of euro. Doesn't matter whether it is 1.4 trillions or like City is saying, or 4 trillions like Thomas, let's see, the other people are saying. We need millions, which is 1,000 times less, and we will be effective. But at least people should listen to that message.
And that segues beautifully into listening to the wind, and that's what this interview series is all about. And I'd like to thank Patrick Englebert from Propelwind, and of course Patrick's always open to answering any questions. Please visit his website, and of course, if there are any follow-up questions to anything that we've covered today in the interview series or in the other interview series episodes, then please contact IWSA too. So once again, thank you very much, Patrick.
Thank you, Gavin.
Bon voyage.
Merci beaucoup.
Au revoir.
Au revoir. Bye-bye.